Good evening and welcome to the 80th George E. Morrison Lecture in Ethnology. My name is Mark Strange and I'm a sinologist based at the School of Culture, History and Language and also at the Australian Centre on China and the World, both of which are part of the College of Asia and the Pacific. And I'm a member of the organising committee for the Morrison Lecture together with my colleague Dr. Benjamin Penny at the back there. As some of you may know, the Morrison Lectures are the longest running lecture series associated with the ANU and its institutional antecedents. The lectures were established in 1932 originally, and so it's a real honour, I think a collective honour actually, to be involved with sustaining that tradition through this evening's event. Now, talk of sustaining traditions and as well as tonight's theme of governing theme of universal values, to which I'm going to come back in a moment, emphasize also, I think, the particular importance of acknowledging that we are meeting today on the traditional country of the Ngunnawal and the Ngambri peoples. So before we go any further, I'd like to pay my respects to the elders of those two peoples and to recognize their cultural heritage, their relationship to this land, and their beliefs and values. And those are values, as far as I understand them, that are intended to be universal values. So let's pause a moment and pay our respects to the traditional custodians of this land. As I say then, tonight's lecture is the 80th in a long and venerable sequence. The Morrison Lecture Series has hosted some of the most eminent scholars from 15 different countries in the name of George E. Morrison himself, who was, of course, a pioneer on a global level. And those speakers have come from an even larger number of different disciplinary backgrounds. So for tonight's lecture, which is, of course, something of a numerical milestone in the series, as a whole, it seems fitting that, to my mind at least, we're going to hear from both a scholar who is both known for his intellectual range, and I'll go over that in a second, on the one hand, but also he's one of the foremost among Australia's own generation of sinologists, and he's also a member of this university on the other hand. So we have I think a nice combination this evening at this kind of watershed moment, or at least this significant moment in the lecture series, to be able to combine both disciplinary breadth that has always been a characteristic of the series, but with someone who is very much a local representative of sinology and of the themes of the lecture series. So it's a great pleasure then to welcome Professor John Makeham as tonight's speaker. John is currently the founding chair and the director of the China Studies Research Centre at La Trobe University in Melbourne. He's also an emeritus professor at the ANU. He worked at this university for a decade before he moved to Melbourne in 2016. He also started his academic career at the ANU. And from his master's and his doctoral work, his projects which he undertook at the ANU, his early research then focused on the field of early Chinese philosophy and early Chinese intellectual history. It took in things like the Book of Changes, Moist thought, but above all, the classical scholarship of the Han Dynasty. And his particular focus at that time was the work of and the thought of Zhaoguang, a scholar of the 2nd and 3rd centuries AD. And that research, which has a certain kind of degree of continuity that ran for about a decade, I guess, produced a series of essays, but also 2 monographs. And the first of those was Name and Actuality in Early Chinese Thought, and that was published in 1994, directly coming out of his doctoral research, and then also a translation of Zhaoguang's Balanced Discourses, published in 2002. From there, as I suggested earlier, John's research has been characterized not only by sinological rigor, but also by great chronological breadth, admirable for someone like me who has rather a narrow focus in our concerns. But John has spread himself widely. His research has made broadly within the field of intellectual history, but has really spread in several directions. So we have this, on the one hand, a long-running and recurring focus on developments of Confucian thought, but spanning really from the early China, from Eastern Han Dynasty through to modern times. More recently in his career, John has turned to Chinese Buddhist thought, analysing in particular what he's called its hybrid identity as it interacted with various forms of Confucianism at various times. Again, there's a certain chronological spread there. And he's also traced the institutional roles of the discipline of philosophy as an academic discipline as it played out and had a social as well as an academic role in modern and contemporary China. So again, a breadth of themes, a breadth of thematic interest, but also a vast chronological spread. And the results of those various lines of research have been a series of influential monograph studies, edited volumes, an intimidating list of articles and book chapters, and a number in very good sinological tradition of academic translations as well. Now, among this substantial and important body of work, I think I'm going to return to probably the work that is most familiar, but also most important in some ways, John's 2003 study of the reception of the Lunyu, of the Analects. His transmitters and creators, Chinese commentators and commentaries on the Analects was the culmination of a series of important studies, which I was brought up with to some degree, of the Analects. And they appeared at a time when scholars of early China were grappling with questions of how, or even if, we might consider this canonical work and other transmitted works as integral books, if you like, whether that had any relevance at all in that period. And John's rigorous combination of traditional sinology on the one hand and hermeneutic theory on the other hand in that work, in Transmitters and Creators, helped, I think, to contribute to some of those larger discussions, but showed in particular how decisively successive generations of Chinese commentators have how decisively they have shaped the way that we read the Analects today. And the work, of course, received the Joseph Levinson Prize, which is really the benchmark award for international sinology. More recently, also, John's many contributions to a very wide span of sinological research have been recognized with a special book award of China, which was presented to him, I think, in the Great Hall of the People in 2015. So, to conclude then, it's against that background of analytical rigor and intellectual breadth that I'm very much looking forward to John's engagement tonight with, it's probably not an overstatement to say, some of the central issues of our time, perhaps not just for China, but also more broadly. The notion of universal values, of course, is the focus of much soul-searching in discussions the world over. Do such values even exist? If so, what are they? What might they be? How are they threatened? How might they be preserved? I mean, these are pressing questions, and they're questions that we read and hear about and probably contemplate ourselves day in, day out. And as China makes a sustained attempt to position itself as a key source for civilizational development worldwide, its contribution to these discussions of universal values, I think, are of fundamental importance to us all as we consider these issues. So let me now hand over to John Makeham to present the 80th George E. Morrison lecture on the topical theme of Chinese philosophy and universal values in contemporary China. John, thank you very much.
Thank you, Mark, for your kind words, and thank you for the honour of inviting me to deliver tonight's lecture, which happens to be the 80th. I'm very pleased that I've been given this opportunity. Tonight's talk is somewhat formal in its structure. It's quite wide-ranging, but I'm sure there are bits of it that will be of interest to many people, even if the whole may be somewhat more complex than some of us might want. I'm going to start by taking a few steps back, a couple of decade steps back, to the situation in Hong Kong and Taiwan. In particular, the late 1970s and the 1980s, much of the 1980s, where there was a growth of a very influential academic movement in both of those regions. And this, I better get my zapper. Okay. And this was a movement that sought to Sinicize or indigenize the social sciences, in particular social psychology, anthropology, and sociology. The movement promoted a return to the cultural roots of being Chinese and the development of Sinicized social and behavioral sciences approaches to research. In Taiwan, the indigenization process began under the name of Zhongguohua, Sinicization, because in the social sciences in the 1980s, China was regarded as the local. The term Bentuhua was also adapted to refer to the same idea. So Bentuhua, Zhongguohua had the same connotations in that context in the 80s. By and large, the term Zhongguohua, Sinicization, came to represented the claim that the social sciences or particular social science disciplines should be grounded in local/regional culture, experience, and perspectives. In this context, the local/regional variously referred to a somewhat vague notion of China or Chinese society, including Taiwan, or to particular Huaren, Sinitic societies, or just to Taiwan itself. The basic theme of the movement was that Chinese social scientists should be self-conscious, self-critical, and independent, that is, not subordinated to the West, so as to contribute to making the world's social science disciplines more cosmopolitan and globalized through proper acknowledgement being afforded to national and cultural particularities. By the mid-1980s, however, the term indigenization in the cultural and political arenas came to refer to the process of Taiwanization. With the end of martial rule and the removal of press restrictions in Taiwan in 1987, as well as the emergence of a growing Taiwanese cultural nationalism that same decade, renewed interest in Taiwanese history and Taiwanese culture began to consolidate and assert itself both in the intellectual and popular discourses. The Kuomintang, the nationalist party, the ruling nationalist party, in 1991 abandoned its claim to being the legitimate government of all of China and the implementation of a democratic electoral system. This legitimized political and intellectual interest in Taiwanese identity or Taiwan identity. Sinicization gradually lost favor in Taiwan during the 1990s as a consequence of the changing political landscape, but during the same period, Sinicization and indigenization both found support amongst anthropologists and psychologists on the mainland. It was also in the 1990s that a similar trend gradually became embedded in the field of philosophy, particularly in mainland China. However, unlike the Sinicization movement in 1970s and 1980s Taiwan, in 1990s mainland China, the goal of recognizing the local was not subordinated to that of introducing a Chinese voice into the discipline of philosophy in order to make the discipline more global and more cosmopolitan, and thereby reinforcing the discipline's universalist claims. Rather, the case of Chinese philosophy emerged as a response to the perceived threat that the universalist claims of theory posed to the particularity of local cultural identity. A watershed in this process of development occurred in the early years of the new millennium, with the so-called legitimacy of Chinese philosophy debate, or actually a series of debates. Many Chinese academics argued that Western philosophy had yet to acknowledge the legitimacy of Chinese philosophy and to engage it as an equal partner in dialogue. Others further insisted that the articulation and the development of China's philosophical heritage must draw exclusively on the paradigms and norms of China's indigenous traditions, and that paradigms and norms derived from the West in particular are not only inappropriate, but also hegemonic and or ill-suited to China's national conditions. For example, writing in 2009, Hong Kong philosopher Shun Huangloi insisted that it is by studying Chinese ethical thought on its own terms that we can bring out its more distinctive ideas, which can then be fleshed out and developed without being shaped by agendas set by Western philosophical discussions. Now, Schwinn drew attention to the consequences of the modern default practice of using Western concepts and frameworks for doing comparative work between Western and Chinese philosophies. He pointed out that, and I quote, "While we see frequent deployment of Western philosophical frameworks in the study of Chinese thought, we rarely encounter the reverse phenomenon, namely the deployment of Chinese philosophical frameworks in the study of Western thought." He continues, "We see engaged discussions of such questions as whether Mozi is a utilitarian, but not whether John Stuart Mill is a Maoist or endorses GNA. We find debates about whether traditional Chinese thought has a conception of rights, but not whether Western traditions have a conception of Li. And more recently, we see debates about whether Confucian ethics is a form of virtue ethics, but not about whether Aristotelian ethics is a form of Li Xue." Now, support for these kinds of concerns was in turn bolstered by what I call a robust Confucian-centered Chinese cultural nationalism. Now, a Confucian-centered Chinese cultural nationalism is a movement based on the ideological conviction that Confucianism is a cultural formation integral to the identity consciousness of the Chinese nation, the Zhonghua Minzu. Similar views were also raised in the context of the Guo Qiyong, or the national learning fad, that also peaked at the end of the first millennium the first decade of the new millennium. Now, although definitions of Guo Qiyong vary, often considerably, most Chinese scholars seem to favour a broad definition, usually along the lines of a generic term for traditional Chinese culture, traditional Chinese scholarship, research on Chinese culture. Now, a major figure in instigating both the legitimacy of Chinese philosophy debate and also reviving Guo Qiyong is this gentleman, Chen Lai. Professor Chen Lai is currently Professor of Philosophy at Tsinghua University and Dean of Tsinghua University's Guo Qiyong, which goes by the English translation of Academy of Chinese Learning. In an influential article published in the Guangming Daily in 2010, he wrote, "Historians long ago pointed out that China's several thousand years of unbroken historical record is unique in the world. The principles informing all social sciences must be subjected to and validated by the test of China's historical experience before their veracity can be proven. The national learning fad helps people to reflect critically on the standpoint from which Western culture takes the particular to be the universal, to reflect critically on the importation or transplantation of Western systems of learning, and by taking due account of China's experience and China's wisdom, establish a subjectivity for Chinese culture and promote the equal exchange of the world's many cultures." Other protagonists at the time also expressed concerns about the effects of Western systems of learning in China. For example, some worried that because China's classical studies, which classical studies is an inalienable part of national learning, they're worried that because classical studies had been reduced to philosophy, philology, history, or anthropology, this had led to methodological confusion and had impeded true understanding. Others despaired that the Western system of academic disciplines has led to the breaking up and fragmentation of China's traditional learning. Because of this, Guo Qiyong, national learning, cannot exist and develop as an organic whole. Consequently, it is difficult to guarantee that China's traditional learning and culture can exert a strong influence among the national cultures of the world. Still others similarly complained that traditional bodies of learning associated with the bibliographic taxonomy of the four divisions, the Sibu, that is, classics, histories, philosophers, and collected writings, have each not only been subjected to dislocation, but that the knowledge contained in each has become mere fodder for disciplines introduced from the West. Since then, complaints about Western cultural imperialism have not only been the concern of academics alone. Concerns about the cultural particularity of so-called universal values have also become a major issue for China's leaders. Consistent with its growing economic, political, and military might, China wants due recognition by and engagement with the global community of nations. This aspiration is complicated by the fact that Chinese political leaders and intellectuals continue to struggle with how Chinese values fit with universal values and global institutions, and whether there's a single global modernity, one perhaps China can shape, or whether there are multiple modernities and multiple, perhaps competitive, universal values. In the wake of the PRC transition leadership to President Xi Jinping in mid-November 2012, the party state's hostility to universal values notably increased. This was most evident when Liu Qibao became head of the publicity department, which oversees propaganda. Early in 2013, a notice was sent out to universities about 7 prohibited discussions, Qibujiang. Universal values topped the list of these prohibited discussions, and even today there's significant reticence about discussing this topic openly. President Xi Jinping's most important speech on universal values was given at the Central Party School at the end of 2015, in which he berated foreign powers for using universal values to subvert China's socialist ideology. He stated, "Within and beyond the nation, various antagonistic powers are always trying to undermine what our party stands for. Most damagingly, they plot to get us to cast aside our faith in Marxism and discard our belief in socialism and communism. And even some of our comrades within the party who haven't clearly perceived the hidden agenda therein think that since Western universal values have endured for several centuries, why shouldn't we identify them? What's wrong with borrowing some Western political discourse? It won't bring any great harm. These people thus unwittingly become a cheer squad for capitalist ideology." In going on to address the topic of strengthening the party's work on theoretical education, Xi Jinping stressed the need for party educators to provide clear guidance to students in the Central Party School about the proper way to understand issues such as the following: the scientific nature of socialism with Chinese characteristics, strengthening and improving the party's leadership, the scientific content of the values of freedom, democracy, and equality, and what in the West are called universal values. Now, it might seem incongruous that values such as freedom, democracy, and equality are distinguished from what Xi Jinping refers to as what in the West are called universal values. Here we need to bear in mind that already in early 2014, the party's ideological authorities had proclaimed a set of core socialist values. It divided into, there are 12 of them, divided into 3 tiers, from the national to the national values, social values, and individual values. I won't read them out, but there they are. But I will turn to look at some of the individual ones. And we're even provided with a handy tree diagram to understand the relationship. Collectively, the 12 values are obviously an amalgam of past and present, local and global conceptual ingredients. Oddly, however, there's quite literally no hint of just what foundation this motley set of values is rooted in. What is clear from Xi Jinping's comments, however, is that freedom, democracy, and equality are not to be identified with their Western namesakes. Despite the explicit criticism of universal values and the championing of core socialist values, some prominent Chinese academics have not only managed to navigate these dangerous political waters, but have also accrued significant political capital in the process. Chen Lai is perhaps the most prominent example. As already noted, Chen is Professor of Philosophy at Tsinghua University and Dean of Tsinghua University's Guo Qiyong. He's widely regarded as one of the foremost specialists of Confucian philosophy in China and has been for a long time. Last year, he was also appointed as a member of the Chinese People's Political Consultative Conference, a national legislative advisory body in the PRC. This appointment is a strong endorsement by the party of Chen Lai and also of his approach to the issue of universal and particular values. In an insightful recent article, the intellectual historian Hoyt Tillman writes, "In the current political environment where Chinese particularistic values are lauded and universals are highly suspect, it is impressive that Chen Lai has set forth a synthesis of Confucianism and Marxism in terms of their projected universalities. For example, his portrayal of freedom, equality, and justice as universally desired goals or values is grounded in his own account of Confucian moral values. Therefore, he's able to propose his case for linking these three values to the political ends of Chinese socialism and the common good of society, rather than through a liberal Western discourse on rights. Now, besides approving of Chen Lai's 2014 book, the Renshui Lun, Humanist-Based Ontology, authorities have reportedly praised Chen Lai's approach to discussing universal values. According to Tillman, and I quote him again, the party-controlled media's embrace of his recent books and articles reinforces the impression that despite its sensitivity to and policies against universal values, the Chinese Communist Party still includes members who are not totally opposed to the universal significance of values, but are anxious to redefine those values to accord not only with Chinese tradition, as Chen Lai has done, but also to be compatible to the conditions deemed necessary for continued political control. Now, Chen Lai is an expert on Neo-Confucian philosophy of the Song and Ming periods. His self-styled humanist-based ontology, this Renshui Benti Lun, is a sophisticated attempt to develop a new ontology, drawing inspiration from a range of thinkers, including the great Neo-Confucian philosopher Zhu Xi. One of Chen's more creative appropriations of Zhu Xi's thought concerns Zhu Xi's account of the unity of the virtues, in which one cardinal virtue, that of humaneness, Ren, is foundational for a group of other cardinal virtues. Specifically, these cardinal virtues are the four that the classical Confucian philosopher Mencius first clustered as a group: humaneness, Ren, doing what is just and right, Yi, behaving with decorum, Li, and wisdom, Zhi. What is distinctive in Zhu Xi's account of the unity of these virtues is that humaneness is presented as sustaining and giving rise to the other three virtues. Chen Lai's creative appropriation was to adapt Zhu Xi's strategy and make humaneness the foundation not only of the other Confucian virtues, but also of the universal values of freedom, equality, and justice. Chen further seeks to persuade us that these three universal values are a legacy of the Chinese Confucian tradition and thus not simply an import from the West. As Tillman notes, the resulting synthesis of values is presented as having distinct advantages over Western programs of universal values. On the one hand, Chen Lai wants to insist that China's concept of humaneness, Ren, can embrace the global, because the Chinese concept of humaneness is the essential foundation of all values. On the other hand, he seeks to reject claims that the Western universal value of democracy should apply to China. In a 2015 article in the Renmin Ribao, Chen Lai wrote, "In discussing the particular characteristics of the values of Chinese civilization, Zhonghua Wenming, we cannot attend only to the moral concepts of Chinese culture, but must also take Western culture as a comparator, in particular the values of modern Western culture, in order to discern the particular characteristics of the values of Chinese civilization. When compared to modern Western values, there are four particular characteristics of the values of Chinese civilization. Responsibility comes before freedom, duty comes before rights, the social group comes before the individual person, and harmony is superior to conflict." He continues, "In Western culture and Western values, there is a conflict mentality that always seeks to use its own power and take a self-centered stance to overcome, control, and dominate others. Because of this, religious wars throughout Western history are extremely brutal. In contrast, China has never experienced such religious wars. It can indeed be said that the cultural origin of the 20th century's two world wars do not lie in the East. Overall, it can be said that when compared to Western culture and Western values, Chinese culture and Chinese values emphasize harmony over conflict. Instead of demonstrating how the values of liberty, equality, and justice are actualized or evident in the policies and institutions of the PRC, Chen Lai uses the Singapore model of Asian values to implicitly support his case that the Chinese value system can encompass such modern values. He further insists that the core of Asian values is Confucian. In 2015, Chen Lai published the volume, The Core Values of Chinese Civilization. In an appendix to that volume, he wrote, "Are there new universal values that have been brought forth out of Confucianism itself, values that differ from liberal democratic ones? I think there are. In today's world, the most influential ones are undoubtedly what Singapore has called Asian values. Asian values include 5 main values. First, the state is more important than the individual. Second, the roots of the state are in the family. Third, the state must respect the individual. Fourth, harmony is better than conflict at maintaining social order. And fifth, there must be peaceful coexistence and complementarity between religions. He continues. I think that if I were to look at the topic of new universal values, I would naturally think of the example of Singapore. These 5 principles not only include traditional East Asian values, they also include new values that have been absorbed from Western civilization over the past century, such as the one stipulating that the state must respect the individual. Actually, however, Singapore's set of Asian values is a systematic set of values that does not give priority to individualism. This is Singapore's version of modern Asian values, and I think this is also Singapore's version of the values of modern Confucian civilization, the core of which is not the priority of the individual's right of freedom, but the good of society and the community. I note in passing that Chen Lai made almost exactly the same comments as far back as 1998, when the Asian values debate was at its height. Before continuing with my account of Chen Lai, I will comment a little more on Asian values. Asian values, of course, refers to the cultural relativist claim that many of the political, social and cultural norms of the late 20th century are Western and not universal norms. As such, these Western norms are no more legitimate than alternative norms which we could call Asian. Asian values is particularly associated with the communitarian position which advocates that the rights of the community, be it the family or the state, take precedence over those of the individual. In the Asian values debate in Singapore in the 1990s, the role of the family created a dilemma for Lee Kuan Yew, as it did for many other advocates of Asian values at the time. Writing at the end of the 1990s, at the end of this decade, or that decade, historian Michael Barr noted that this is because the family is expected to fulfill 2 contradictory roles. He wrote, "It needs to be the building block of society and to provide the rationale for the paternalistic state, but it's also expected to be completely and often humiliatingly subservient to the needs of the state and the needs of the capitalist economy. Family-based communitarianism can and is being used as a tool to support state-focused communitarianism, but this is not its natural function. In the purest forms, the 2 are rivals. In its most extreme form, state-focused communitarianism is a form of totalitarianism that cannot allow any alternative source of authority or power in society." As it happens, a similar tension has been playing itself out in China over the past decade, in a series of ongoing debates between 2 prominent Chinese philosophers, Guo Qiyong and Liu Qingping, as well as their large numbers of respective supporters. The debates have focused on the concept of filial piety, xiao. Liu Qingping has argued that Confucian philosophy rests on a fundamental paradox. On the one hand, it privileges consanguineous affection, love for one's family members, and yet on the other hand, it privileges loving concern for all. According to Liu, Confucianism should put a more universal ethic at its core and get rid of its emphasis on kin relations, paving the way for a new post-Confucianism which would value universal care or concern well ahead of filial piety. In response, Guo Qiyong defended the idea of the mutual non-disclosure of the wrongdoings among family members based on the authority of early texts such as Mencius and the Analects. Guo maintained that this moral principle is grounded in human nature and is to be found both in the East and in the West. In turn, Guo's critics saw his position as supporting the obstruction of justice, in which law-breaking family members are protected from state retribution. Although Liu and Guo both appeal to the principle of universal values, Guo's position is of particular interest in that it prioritises the family over the state. Despite this stance, it seems to have had no negative impact on Guo's prominent role in promoting both Confucian philosophy and also national learning, Guoxue, in China. It's also worth noting one of the practical outcomes of Guo's activism. In August 2011, at the 22nd session of the 11th National People's Congress, Guo's proposal to restore the system of mutual concealment was incorporated into the draft amendment of the Criminal Procedure Law of the People's Republic of China and was duly approved in March the following year. As with Guo Qiyong and Chen Lai, a number of prominent Western scholars who work in the field of Chinese philosophy have also been critical of values that are based on the notion of the atomic individual. In particular, the positions taken by comparative philosopher Roger Ames and the political theorist Daniel Bell, both of whom happen to be Canadians, have lent considerable support to the agenda of philosophers such as Chen Lai. I also note that both Ames and Bell now work in universities in China and in fact have been for some time. Ames objects to forms of Western ethical theorizing such as virtue ethics in which the individual is the focus. He argues that the language of virtue ethics, which appeals to the vocabulary of agents, acts, generic virtues, character traits, autonomy, motivation, reasons, choice, freedom, principles, consequences, and so on, introduces distinctions that assume a foundational individualism as its starting point. With deep roots in the classical Greek tradition, or the classical Greek philosophical narrative, he insists that individualism has become a default common sense assumption, if not an ideology. He further argues that it has gained a monopoly on human consciousness without any serious alternative to challenge it. Instead, he proposes what he calls Confucian role ethics, R-O-L-E, role ethics, arguing that it provides a better ethical model. At the heart of Confucian role ethics is, and I quote, a specific vision of human beings as relational persons, constituted by the roles they live rather than as individual selves. Ames provides the following illustration. Confucian normativity is defined by living one's family roles to maximum effect. Lived family roles, mothering, brothering, granddaughtering, are themselves normative standards that, informed as they are by existential embodiment, are much clearer and more concrete than putative moral principles. Now, this critique of ethical models in which the individual is the fundamental unit is also a key element in the utopian political order proposed by influential IR theorist Zhao Tingyang. I am, of course, referring to his tianxia, or all under heaven model. Historian Wang Gongwu, who's emeritus professor at ANU, describes the historical notion of tianxia as an abstract notion embodying the idea of a superior moral authority that guided behaviour in a civilized world. It depicts an enlightened realm that Confucian thinkers and mandarins raised to one of universal values used to determine who was civilized and who was not. Now, in his own version of tianxia, Zhao Tingyang describes the place of the individual as follows. All under heaven takes the whole world as a single political system that is much greater and higher than a single country or nation state. The Chinese system of family states and all under heaven, which differs fundamentally from the Western system of individuals, nations, and internationals, is often criticised for its neglect of the individual as well as individual rights, but this is a misunderstanding. There is no Chinese denial of the value of the individual, but rather a denial of the individual to be a political foundation or starting point, because the political only makes sense when it deals with relations rather than individuals, and the political is meant to speak for coexistence rather than single existence. Another influential political theorist who takes a similar stance to Ames and Zhao on the status of the individual is Daniel Bell, who I mentioned just a short while ago. Daniel Bell is Dean of the School of Political Science and Public Administration at Shandong University, which is quite an achievement. There are not many foreigners, non-Chinese nationals, who've been appointed to senior ranks in Chinese universities, particularly in politically sensitive areas like political science and public administration. In his early work, Beyond Liberal Democracy, Political Thinking for an East Asian Context, Bell criticised liberal democracy and the shortcomings of liberal individualism. In his recent and more widely discussed book, The China Model, Political Meritocracy and the Limits of Democracy, Bell's target is electoral democracy and what he calls the tyranny of the majority. For Bell, the danger of electoral democracy is that irrational and self-interested majorities acting through the democratic process, can use their power to oppress minorities and enact bad policies. Sound familiar? In contrast, he argues the virtue of political meritocracy is that examinations that test for voter competence can help to remedy this flaw. As with Chen Lai, Bell also touts Singapore's political meritocracy as a viable alternative to electoral democracy. As for China, he writes, the leading political idea in China, widely shared by government officials, reformers, intellectuals, and the people at large, I don't know how he knows that, is what I call vertical political meritocracy, meaning democracy at lower levels of government, with the political system becoming progressively more meritocratic at higher levels of government. Bell, of course, has no shortage of detractors. He's been criticised for offering little evidence of meritocracy at work and no more than a theoretical argument in its defence. Others attack him for presenting a fictional China as a rhetorical platform from which to continue a long-standing debate internal to Western political thought, the debate between communitarianism and liberal democracy. Now, despite these and many other criticisms, his status in China as a public intellectual of some note has in no way been tarnished. I should mention also that both Ames and Bell, while they publish widely in English, they also publish widely in Chinese, and many of their works have been translated into Chinese. So their ideas are well known in China. Mention should also be made of another academic, Stephen Angle. He's an American scholar of Confucianism, and his self-styled progressive Confucianism. He even has a website if you want to chase up more specific details. It's a English language, Chinese language website. The case of Angle provides a counterpoint to the anti-individualist stance of Chen Lai, Ames, Zhao and Bell. According to Angle, ethical insight leads to progressive political change, which in turn leads to greater realisation of our potential for virtue. The institutions advocated by progressive Confucians are valued not because of their ancient pedigree, but because of their capacity to assist in the realisation of the fundamental human virtues that Confucians have valued since ancient times. Social structures that set barriers to the realisation of virtue, therefore, need to be critiqued and changed. Despite the fundamental differences from Ames and Zhao on the issue of atomic individuals, Angle is sympathetic to Zhao's normative concept of all under heaven, because it requires, and I quote, to view the world from the perspective of the world. This perspective, Angle argues, requires us to arrive at the universal world perspective through an inclusive process rather than universalising a single perspective. Thus, human rights and other principles of modern liberal philosophy can be deemed to be relevant in Confucian philosophy, even if they did not derive from prior Confucian values. Angle's critics, however, argue that on his analysis, Confucianism is relevant and modern only to the extent that it can accommodate the values of some form of liberal democracy. In other words, Angle continues to articulate the validity of Confucian ideas in terms shaped almost exclusively by modern European thought and experience. As with Chen Lai, over the past decade, a group of younger academics based at various universities in China has also been arguing for the priority of the nation over the individual. This group has become known informally as the Kang Clique, the Kangdang. Several prominent figures associated with the Kang Clique were also participants in a workshop held at East China Normal University in 2011. The transcripts of discussions from the workshop were published 2 years later under the title, What is Universal? Whose Values? Contemporary Confucians Discuss Universal Values. The name Kang Clique derives from the call by some of its members, such as Chen Ming and Gan Chunsong, to return to Kang Youwei. Kang Youwei was a major intellectual and reformer active in the transition between the Qing Empire and the establishment of Republican China in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. For many Confucian revivalists today, particularly those who self-consciously identify as so-called Mainland New Confucians, Kang had proposed a superior blueprint for nation building and state building. at a critical juncture in Chinese history as it moved from being an empire to being a nation state. Chen Lai, for example, writes that in Kang Yui's blueprint, the integrity of the nation and maintenance of the people's livelihood took historical priority over individual rights, constitutional democracy, freedom of belief, and other value priorities of the Enlightenment project. Here, the Enlightenment project refers to the liberal intellectual tradition in modern China. Chen laments that ultimately Kang's vision was hijacked by the agenda set by liberal intellectuals in China. He continues, "The Enlightenment project and its utopian narrative should have been chosen only if they could have served as a program for salvation. We should not and cannot allow theory to swallow up facts or means to become ends. But, most unfortunately, this is where our biggest problems are today." In other words, the utopian vision of China's liberal intellectuals continue to block Kang's blueprint from being realised. For Confucian revivalists such as Chen Lai, a key element in Kang's blueprint was the proposal to make Confucianism the state religion. And this is something that Chen Lai and his colleagues continue to argue for today. Kang Yue is also relevant to the topic of tianxia, all under heaven. Kang Yue was associated with a lineage of Confucian scholarship known as New Text Confucianism. New Text Confucianism has its origins in the Han Dynasty 2,000 years ago, but was revived and creatively reinterpreted in the 19th century. One of the key figures in New Text Confucianism, one of the key features of New Text Confucianism is its emphasis on a cyclical view of history, characterised by a three-stage periodisation. Kang Yue transformed this cyclical model into a teleological model of three-stage progress, which culminates in the utopian vision of an age of universal peace or great unity. As with Chen Lai, Kang Yue attached a particularly high importance to the moral ideal of Ren, humaneness, that we introduced earlier. For Kang, Ren represents a metaphysical worldview, a moral ideal or value pattern built into the structure of reality. He projected the full realisation of Ren to a distant but definite point in the future, the age of universal peace or great unity. His vision of this great unity amounted to an all-inclusive universal society with no place for the territorial state. As a utopian commonwealth, it's not unlike Zhao Tingyang's vision for his so-called tianxia system. Another prominent Chinese public intellectual who's also been active in promoting the concept of tianxia as an inclusive political institution that transcends the nation state and nationalism is Shanghai-based academic Jilin. In sharp contrast to the Kang Clique, Xu is strongly opposed to nationalism. Xu maintains that nationalism can lead to horrific large-scale violence such as the two world wars. As with Zhao Tingyang, his antidote to nationalism is what he calls the new tianxia, or the new all under heaven. He describes tianxia in traditional China as a world spatial imaginary with China's central plains at its core, and claims that the values of this civilizational tradition were universal and humanistic, rather than particular and unique to one civilization or culture. Xu maintains that behind the traditional Chinese empire was a tianxia consciousness for all humanity, a set of universal values that transcended the particular interests of any given dynasty. Their source was the moral way of heaven. These values served as a standard for determining right and wrong throughout all under heaven, constrained the behaviour of rulers, and determined the legitimacy of a given dynasty's rule. He then makes the following comments about post-tianxia China, that is, China over the last 100 years. An empire without tianxia consciousness means that the imperial body no longer possesses a soul with universal values and a civilization that puts people at ease. In its place, there is nothing but calculation of the nation-state's self-interest. Yet, if traditional tianxia was so cosmopolitan and universal, how does Xu explain the age-old distinction between barbarians and Chinese, a distinction that has been a consistent hallmark of the notion of tianxia? While acknowledging that people in pre-modern China spoke not just of tianxia, but also of the difference between barbarians and Chinese, Xu insists that In early China, notions of Chinese and barbarian were completely different from the dichotomies of China and the West, and us and them that today's extreme nationalists are always talking about. That which determined the distinction between barbarian and Chinese was solely whether or not a civilization was associated with the values of tianxia. Whereas tianxia was absolute, the categories of barbarian and Chinese were relative. Whereas blood and race were innate and unchangeable, civilization could be studied and emulated. He further claims that in traditional China, tianxia did not belong to one particular race or country. Now, despite Xu Jilin's reputation as a liberal public intellectual strongly opposed to nationalism, some of his discussion of China as a civilizational power invites questions about his vision for a so-called new tianxia. If China's goal is not to stop with the construction of the nation state, but rather to re-establish itself as a civilizational power with great influence in global affairs, then its every word and deed must take universal civilization as its point of departure, and in global dialogue, it must have its own unique understanding of universal civilization. As a great power with global influence, what China must now realise is not just the dream of rejuvenating the nation and the state, but also the reorientation of its national spirit toward the world. What China needs to recognise is not a particularistic culture suited to one country and one people, but rather a civilization that has universal value for all humanity. Values that are good for China, particularly the core values that concern our shared human nature, should in the same way be good for all humanity. The message here is decidedly mixed. On the one hand, Xu calls for the reconstruction of values that have universal significance for all humanity and not just one culture or society. On the other hand, this aspiration seems to be fundamentally compromised by his other claim that due to China's unique understanding of universalist civilization, which in turn is grounded in China's pre-modern tradition of tianxia, then China should seek to re-establish itself as a civilizational power with great influence in global affairs and reconstruct a civilization that has universal value for all humanity. Xu supports his claim that China is well prepared to re-establish itself as a civilizational power by invoking American political scientist Lucian Pye's well-known aphorism that China is a civilization pretending to be a nation state. Xu further reinforces this sense of historical destiny by then claiming that China is a world power. As a nation of the world that bears Hegel's world spirit, it is only proper that it take responsibility for the world and the world spirit it has inherited. This world spirit is the new tianxia that will emerge in the form of universal values. Xu asserts that values that are good for China, particularly the core values that concern our shared human nature, should in the same way be good for all humanity. Yet, is the import of this claim really so very different from that conveyed by Chen Lai's assertion that humaneness is the foundation not only of Confucian values, but of the universal values of freedom, equality, and justice? After all, from a Confucian perspective, humaneness is an innate quality of our common human nature, and so must be good for all humanity. Indeed, despite the appeal to universal values, in Xu Jilin's notion of new tianxia, it seems that it is Confucianism alone that is presented as the authority for determining which values constitute core values. He explains that historically the greatness of Confucianism came from its capacity to transcend the interests of the individual and the dynasty. Today, he says, being above the state, Confucianism possesses the universal values of tianxia. By insisting that values that are good for China should in the same way be good for all humanity, Xu is making a case for expanding the range of universal values, but does so in a way that privileges Confucian values. China's components of tianxia are not without their critics. One of the most prominent is historian Zhaoguang of Fudan University. He comments as follows: in recent years, some Chinese scholars have felt that as China begins its rise after several centuries of a world order led by the West, a tianxia order or tianxiaism that has its origins in traditional China should be deemed a fresh resource for replacing the world order that has been in place since the early modern period. Guo points out that these scholars argue that on a philosophical level, the Confucian world is a world without borders, one without the distinction of inner and outer, us and them. It is a world in which all people are treated equally. Accordingly, this tianxia order should be used to replace the current world order. He warns that if this kind of thinking is not stripped of its core of nationalism, which sees China as the core, as the centre of tianxia, and its attitude of arrogant self-regard, then it can easily become a new form of chauvinism that claims to have universal relevance under the cover of representations such as equality of the multitude of states and all in the four seas are one family. Guo is also critical of some of the more radical mainland New Confucians, which includes members of the Kang Clique, contributors to the publication that we discussed above, What is Universal, Whose Values? Contemporary Confucians Discuss Universal Values, as well as contributors to a wide range of more recent publications, including the 2016 volume, Why China Must Reconfucianize, New Proposals by Mainland New Confucians. The fact that a scholar of Zhaoguang's standing in the academic community should devote a 33,000 Chinese character essay to critiquing their views underscores the growing influence of this conservative and extremely nationalistic group of ideologues. In the essay, he describes how mainland New Confucians feel that to acknowledge universal values is to succumb to westernization and amounts to self-barbarization. He points out that the idea of barbarization is an extremely strong accusation because it elevates the distinction between Chinese and barbarian from that of differences in values to that of a clash between the civilized and the uncivilized, or even between races and cultures in absolute opposition. Again, I emphasise that the distinction between Chinese and barbarian is very much central to traditional tianxia discourse. Chen Lai's creative appropriation of Zhuxi's philosophy to make the virtue or value of humaneness the foundation not only of Confucian virtues, but also of the universal values of freedom, equality, and justice is without doubt an exercise in hybridisation, albeit a highly reductionist and politically calculated hybridisation. We'll have to wait to see whether an ideological cocktail of Confucian and core socialist values will provide the right formula for some future tianxia world order. Yet, what might that future tianxia world order be like? Zhaoguang warns of the following scenario if the concept of tianxia should be brought to life. When imagined versions of the tribute system, which is part of the traditional tianxia operation, are taken to be real and memories of the celestial empire are unearthed, then perhaps Chinese culture and national sentiment will turn into nationalism or statism that opposes both global civilization and regional cooperation. Such a development would truly lead to a clash of civilization. Or is the future already here? In a recent article published in the journal Foreign Affairs, University of Sydney sociologist Salvatore Babones describes what he calls the American tianxia. It's not his term. The term American tianxia is actually coined by Wang Gungwu, who I briefly referred to a while ago. But Babones does his own thing with it. Let me conclude with his description of the dystopian, brave new world that he conjures up. Today, the United States is at the centre of a global tianxia. This American tianxia is much more than a state or country or even an empire. It pervades all areas of life. In today's connected world, Chinese businesses, Russian universities, and even Iranian revolutions are run on American lines. The Islamic State, ISIS, recommends that its fighters use Android devices, whereas North Korea's ruling Kim family famously prefers Apple. Many people around the world oppose the United States, its policies, and its president, but they still want to send their children to American universities, invest their money in American companies, and express their opinions on American social networks. This is not some kind of consumerism run amok. Standing at the centre of the global order, the United States has, over the last quarter century, reoriented the way the world, and especially the world's elite, works, plays, and thinks. It has brought them into an international hierarchy in which gaining status requires succeeding in the US-centred networks and playing by US rules. And it makes 21st century America more powerful than any empire, kingdom, or commonwealth in history. The United States, that is, the country itself, has plenty of hard and soft power. But the United States has limits. The American tianxia does not. Thank you. That's the end of my speech.